Okay, so this is Unit 1, Module 1 of AP Psychology. Unit 1 is Psychology's History and Approaches, and Module 1 focuses basically just on psychology's history. So we're going to start with psychology's roots. So we can trace psychology all the way back to the time of Socrates and Plato in ancient Greece. And these two philosophers concluded that the mind and body are separate, and that the mind can actually continue after death. And so they believed that knowledge was innate, meaning that you're just born with knowledge. Fast forward a little bit to Aristotle, also in ancient Greece. He was a student of Plato, who was a student of Socrates, but Aristotle disagreed with Socrates and Plato. He said that knowledge is not innate. We're not just born with our knowledge. It grows from our experiences. Fast forward even more, René Descartes in France actually went back to believing in what Socrates and Plato believed in, that mind and body are separate and that knowledge is innate. He actually conducted some experiments where he dissected animals and concluded that the brain fluid in these animals contained animal spirits. And he theorized about nerve pathways and how the mind and body are connected. So you see, over time, the early psychologists have developed these different theories about how the mind and body work together. Out of all these different theories, we have two main theories, monism and dualism. Monism means that the mind and body are inseparable, and that would be a belief of Aristotle. Whereas dualism, people who believe in that think that the mind and body are separate. Okay, so now we're going to go through a couple of other people who weren't necessarily psychologists, but did contribute to the field of psychology. One of those is Francis Bacon. He was in England, and he's considered one of the founders of modern science. And that's because he developed the scientific method, which we're going to get more into in the coming chapters. But most of you should know what the scientific method is, where you have a question, you formulate a hypothesis, and you design some sort of experiment to test that hypothesis. So the scientific method is used in psychology just as much as it's used in other sciences, and so we look at Francis Bacon as one of the originators of psychology as well. And then another one is John Locke. He was also in England. He was a British political philosopher. And he was the author of an essay called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And in this essay, he argued that the mind was a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, on which experience writes. So in this sense, he would have agreed with Aristotle that knowledge is not innate, that knowledge grows from our experiences instead. He says that our mind is a blank slate, and everything we learn comes from our experiences. So this goes along with the idea of empiricism, which is the view that knowledge originates in experience, and that science should, therefore, rely on observation and experimentation. So it really wasn't until 1879 when psychology or psychological science was actually born. You had all of these people before that time talking about the mind and the body and things like that, but we didn't really get psychology itself until 1879. And that really started with Wilhelm Wundt in Germany. He was a professor at Leipzig University of Leipzig in Germany. And he created an apparatus that measured the time lag between people's hearing a ball hit a platform and they're pressing a key or a button. So basically he's trying to figure out how quickly your mind works. So you hear a ball and then you press a button, and he wanted to measure and see how long that took. So he found that people responded in a tenth of a second when asked to press the button as soon as the sound occurred. He also found that people responded within 0.2 of a second when asked to press the button as soon as they were consciously aware of perceiving that sound. So not just as the sound was heard, but when they were aware that they heard the sound. So they have to think about hearing the sound first and then press the button. And that added a tenth of a second to their time. So with this experiment, we say that Wilhelm Wundt founded the first psychological laboratory. He's the first person that's actually measuring anything with the brain. Okay, so thinking about the mind's structure. This is something we're going to talk about a lot throughout the year, is the structure of the brain. And so we have to kind of go all the way back and talk about how the original psychologists thought how the brain was structured. So Edward Bradford Titchener was actually a student of Wilhelm Wundt. And he, was in Germany, but he came back to America. That's where he was originally from. Came back to America and joined the faculty of Cornell University. And Titchener introduced the idea of structuralism. Structuralism is an early school of thought that was promoted by both Wundt and Titchener. And they used something called introspection to reveal the structure of the human mind. And they sought to identify what the mind and consciousness were. So looking at introspection, it's basically asking subjects to accurately describe their cognitive reactions to stimuli. Cognitive means thinking, anything to do with thinking, learning, remembering, those sorts of things. That's what cognitive means. So asking subjects to accurately describe their cognitive reactions to stimuli is introspection. So for example, subjects might be asked to describe their sensations or thoughts as they smelled a scent, or they tasted a substance, or they looked at a dog. But here's the thing, introspection is not a reliable method of study. And that's because it varies widely from person to person and from experience to experience. What you think might taste good might taste bad to someone else. What you think might smell good might smell bad to someone else. So it's not really a reliable method of study. Okay, thinking about the mind's functions. So this is William James. He was a psychologist who was influenced by the ideas of Charles Darwin. And he thought that thinking, like smelling or tasting, evolved and adapted to contribute to human survival. And he came up with the idea of functionalism, which explored how mental and behavioral processes function, or how they enable the organism to adapt, survive, and flourish. Another early psychologist thinking about the mind's functions was Mary Whiton Calkins. So in 1890, William James went against Harvard's president by admitting Mary Calkins into his graduate seminar. All the male students in James's seminar then dropped out of the program because they didn't want a woman to be in the program. So James continued to just tutor her alone. He didn't care that all the other people dropped out. Though Calkins finished the program and did very well on her exams, Harvard still denied her the degree. She was not allowed to be awarded the degree. But Calkins did go on to become the American Psychological Association's first female president in 1905. Another prominent female in early psychology was Margaret Floyd Washburn. She was the first female to be awarded a psychology PhD, even though that should have gone to Calkins. She was denied. So Washburn is the first woman to earn the psychology PhD. And she was also the second female APA president, 1921. And in a time when behaviorism was growing in popularity, which is just a field of psychology we'll talk about later, Washburn published something called The Animal Mind, which opposed the idea that only observable events should be studied and included in the field of psychology. She was interested in mental events as well. So she's saying, like, we can't just study things that we can see. We have to study the things that we can't see as well. And so eventually all of this leads into experimental psychology, the study of behavior and thinking using the experimental method. So psychological science develops with experimental psychology. Two early leaders in psychology were John Watson and B.F. Skinner. Watson and Skinner were both charismatic, provocative scientists who changed how the scientific community defined psychology. They defined psychology as the scientific study of observable behavior. And therefore, they were actually uninterested in studying mental processes. So they developed the idea of behaviorism, the view that psychology, 1, should be an objective science, that 2, studies behavior without reference to mental processes. Now, most modern psychologists will agree with number 1, that it should be an objective science, but they do not agree with number 2, that it should not refer to mental processes. Obviously, psychology is a lot about mental processes. Just an interesting little tidbit about John Watson here. His wife was Mary Watson. She actually faked an illness at a dinner party with that was being held with a woman named Rosalie Rayner, who was John's graduate student assistant. And her faked illness got her into Rosalie's bedroom, where she discovered some love letters that her husband John had written to Rosalie. And so Mary and John got a divorce, and it became front page news. It was a huge scandal. And the love letters were even published in the papers. So John then married Rosalie and began working for an advertisement agency. He didn't even continue in psychology after that. He was embarrassed by the scandal. Okay, one of the most famous psychologists is Sigmund Freud. Freudian psychology emphasizes the way our subconscious thought processes and our emotional responses to childhood experiences affect our behavior. And so when we talk about Freud, we're going to be talking about the psychodynamic approach, which is an updated, more modern day version of Freud's ideas. But it's all about going back to your childhood experiences. Two other psychologists we're going to talk about over this course, Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Rogers and Maslow thought that behaviorism and Freudian psychology were too narrow in focus. They were too limited. And so they proposed humanistic psychology, which emphasized the growth potential of healthy people. And it emphasized the importance of having our needs for love and acceptance satisfied. And we're going to get more into the details of that later on. And then in the 1960s, we had this cognitive revolution. It was a group of psychologists that basically rebelled against behaviorism. These psychologists renewed interest in mental processes, leading to the establishment of cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, which is the interdisciplinary study of the brain activity linked with cognition, including perception, thinking, memory, and language. And so psychology today, we consider both observable and non-observable events important to the study of psychology. Therefore, we define psychology as the science of behavior and mental processes. And we're going to talk way more about all of these people and all of these different approaches as the course goes on.